True story, bullied in a small New Zealand town. Her silent strength changed a nation. For nearly 4 years, the sun rose over the steaming lakes and rolling hills of Rotorua, painting the town gold while most were still asleep. In those early hours, before the playgrounds filled with noise and color, Aroha would walk alone down the narrow streets, her breath visible in the cold air, her woolen jersey pulled close. She had learned, long ago, that blending in meant survival. To be invisible was safer, or so she thought. The morning mist rolled off Lake Rotorua like whispered secrets, curling around the pohutukua trees that lined her path to school. Aroha's footsteps echoed softly on the wet concrete, a rhythm she'd grown to know by heart. 4 years of the same walk, the same careful navigation between shadow and light, between being seen and being safe. Her house sat on a quiet street where the gardens overflowed with native flax and the neighbors knew each other's stories by heart. The weatherboard walls had seen decades of Rotorua winters, and the floors creaked in all the familiar places, by the kitchen door where her mum Panya made her morning tea, near the window where the morning light first touched their small lounge, and especially by Aroha's bedroom door, where she'd learned to step carefully so no one would know she was awake before dawn, thinking. Aroha's world was small, her mother Panya, their old weatherboard house with creaky floors and the scent of manuka honey in the kitchen, and the little treasures she kept in a showbox beneath her bed. She collected feathers, stones polished smooth by the lake, and notes scribbled on torn pieces of paper. Her father's handwriting, faded now, was still the most precious. The showbox held more than trinkets. It held pieces of who she used to be, before the silence became her shield. There were photos from primary school sports days where her smile reached her eyes, birthday cards from cousins in Auckland who still sent Christmas presents but rarely visited, and a small carved bone pendant her father had given her the week before the accident. "Kia kaha, my girl," he'd whispered, fastening it around her neck. "Be strong." She hadn't worn it since the funeral, but she touched it every morning before school. Panya worked 2 jobs, cleaning offices before dawn and stacking shelves at Pack and Save in the evenings. She moved through their small house like a gentle storm, always busy, always caring, always trying to fill the spaces that grief had carved out of their lives. "How was school, love? Did you make a new friend today? Shall we take a walk down by the lake before tea?" Her questions hung in the air like prayers, hopeful and unanswered. At Rotorua High, the days stretched long. From the moment she entered the gates, she felt eyes on her, sometimes cold, sometimes just curious. She wasn't like the other girls. Her hair was always tied back, her jersey a size too big, the school shoes second-hand but polished every Sunday night. During tea breaks, Aroha would wander to the bush edge, where the sound of the city faded and the ponga trees whispered old secrets. The school grounds sprawled across several acres, with modern buildings mixed among older weatherboard classrooms that reminded Aroha of home. She knew every corner, every quiet spot, every place where she could disappear when the weight of being watched became too heavy. Behind the science block, there was a bench where she'd eat her lunch alone, watching the tui birds dart between the native trees. Near the sports shed, a gap in the fence led to a walking track that wound through regenerating bush, her escape route when the world felt too loud. The other students moved in packs, their laughter carrying across the quad like music she couldn't quite join. They wore their uniforms with casual confidence, hair flowing loose, bags slung carelessly over shoulders. They belonged in a way that seemed effortless, in a way that felt impossible for someone like her. Most days, the bullying was quiet. Someone would hide her school bag, whisper her name and laugh. Once, someone poured water into her shoes. The teachers noticed little. The other students noticed everything, and said nothing. It started small, as these things always do. A few giggles when she walked past. Her name whispered just loud enough for her to hear, but not loud enough for teachers to catch. Aroha the weirdo. Aroha the freak. Sometimes they'd move just as she approached a group, creating a circle that excluded her without words. Other times, they'd bump into her in the corridor, books spilling across the floor while they muttered half-hearted apologies that fooled no one. The cruelty was surgical in its precision. They knew exactly how to hurt without leaving marks, how to isolate without being obvious, how to make her feel invisible while ensuring she was painfully seen. Her pencil case would go missing during maths class. Her lunch would disappear from her bag, leaving her hungry and too proud to ask for help. Once, she found her homework covered in muddy footprints outside the English classroom, too damaged to hand in. But perhaps the worst part wasn't the actions themselves, it was the way the other students looked through her when it happened. Teachers chatting by the staff room door while her books were kicked down the hallway. Classmates studying intently as someone poured juice into her bag. The conspiracy of silence that surrounded her suffering, as if acknowledging it would somehow make them complicit. Still, Aroha's silence was never empty. At home, Panya tried to fill the spaces. How was school? Did you make a new friend? Let's go for a walk down by the lake, eh? Aroha answered with a nod, a small smile, but her real story stayed tucked away, words caught behind her teeth. The evenings were the hardest. After Panya left for her second job, the house would settle into a quiet that felt different from peace. Aroha would sit at the kitchen table, homework spread before her, but her mind would wander to the day's small cruelties. She'd replay conversations where she'd stayed silent, moments where she could have spoken up but chose safety instead. The pencil would pause over her maths problems as she wondered what would have happened if she'd been braver, if she'd been different. Some nights, she'd call out to her mum just as Panya reached the front door. "Mum," she'd say, and Panya would pause, hope flickering across her tired face. But the words would stick, and Aroha would shake her head. "Nothing. Just, have a good night at work." And Panya would nod, understanding more than she let on, and press a kiss to the top of Aroha's head before stepping into the cold night air. Winter came early that year. Mornings were white with frost, the grass sparkling, the smell of wood smoke drifting from the chimneys. One morning, after a night of rain and wind, Aroha found a note in her locker, neat handwriting, just 2 words, "No one cares." She stared at it for a long time, feeling something shift inside, a weight settling where hope used to live. She didn't show her mother. She didn't tell the teachers. That afternoon, she walked further than usual, deep into the bush, until the sound of cars and school bells was gone. The note was written on expensive paper, the kind used for birthday invitations or thank you cards. The handwriting was careful, practiced. Someone had taken time with this message. Someone had thought about it, planned it, chosen their words deliberately. No one cares. Not nobody likes you or you're weird. Those would have been easier to dismiss as childish taunts. This was worse. This was a statement of fact, delivered with surgical precision. Aroha folded the note carefully and slipped it into her jersey pocket, where it sat against her ribs like a stone. Throughout the day, she was hyper-aware of its presence, the way it crinkled slightly when she moved, the way its corners pressed through the fabric. In chemistry class, she found herself touching her pocket absently, making sure it was still there. During lunch, she took it out and read it again, as if the words might have changed. The bush track behind the school was overgrown and rarely used. Aroha pushed through the low-hanging branches, her school shoes slipping on the damp leaves underfoot. The further she walked, the quieter the world became, until even the distant hum of traffic faded to nothing. Here, surrounded by nikau palms and tree ferns, she could finally breathe. There, among the ferns, she picked up a tea feather, green-black, shimmering blue at the edges, light as breath but strong as memory. She slipped it into her jersey pocket, and from that day on, carried it everywhere, a silent companion. The feather was perfect, unmarked by weather or wear. It must have fallen that morning, perhaps during the dawn chorus when the tea sang their liquid songs from the canopy above. Aroha held it up to the filtered sunlight, watching the way the colors shifted and changed, black to green to deep purple, like oil on water. Beautiful and wild and utterly itself. She thought of her father then, how he used to tell her stories about the tea. Clever birds, he'd say, adaptable. They know when to sing and when to be quiet. They know how to survive. The feather felt warm between her fingers, and for the first time in weeks, something loosened in her chest. Not happiness, exactly, but something close to hope. Her world grew quieter. At school, she spoke only when spoken to. She became the girl who drifted, there, but not really seen. Teachers wrote withdrawn on her report card. Panya left little notes in her lunchbox. You're brave, my girl. Kia kaha. I see you. But Aroha only nodded. Even at home, the silences grew long. The transformation was gradual but complete. Where once Aroha had occasionally raised her hand in class or offered tentative answers when called upon, now she sat perfectly still, eyes downcast, speaking only when directly addressed. Her teachers began to worry, but their concern felt distant, abstract, like voices calling from across a great divide. Mrs. Henderson, her English teacher, kept her after class one afternoon. Is everything all right at home, Aroha? She asked gently, her kind eyes searching Aroha's face. You seem different lately. Aroha nodded, mumbled something about being tired, about helping her mum with chores. Mrs. Henderson's expression softened with understanding. She knew about single mothers and night shift work, about teenagers who carried too much responsibility. She let Aroha go with a gentle squeeze of her shoulder and a reminder that she was always available to talk. But how could Aroha explain that the problem wasn't at home? That home was her sanctuary, the only place where she felt safe. How could she describe the way silence had become her armor, the way invisibility felt like survival? The words existed somewhere inside her, but they felt locked away, protected by layers of caution and shame. The school year crawled. Sometimes, Aroha thought about running away, taking the night bus to Hamilton, or the train to Wellington, disappearing into the city. But each morning, she woke early, laced up her boots, and walked to school. Sometimes, doing nothing but enduring was an act of courage. The fantasy was always the same. She'd pack her few precious belongings, leave a note for Panya explaining that it wasn't her fault, and slip away before dawn. In Hamilton, she'd find work in a cafe or shop, rent a small room somewhere anonymous, start over where no one knew her story. In Wellington, she'd walk the waterfront at sunrise, watch the ferries cut through the harbour, lose herself among the government workers and university students. But fantasy was easier than reality. She had no money beyond the few dollars Panya gave her for lunch each day, no connections beyond Rotorua, no real understanding of how the world worked beyond her small-town bubble. More than that, she couldn't bear the thought of Panya coming home to an empty house, calling her name into silence, finding only a note where her daughter should be. So she stayed. She walked to school each morning, endured each day, walked home each afternoon. The routine became a kind of meditation, a way of moving through time without having to fully inhabit it. Step by step, breath by breath, heartbeat by heartbeat. Survival measured in the smallest possible increments. The turning point was the haka. Each winter, the whole school gathered in the hall, students, teachers, even parents sometimes. It was a moment of tradition, of unity, of manner. Aroha always stood at the back, half hidden. But this year, something inside her ached to be seen. The assembly hall was packed, every seat filled, students standing along the walls when the chairs ran out. The air thrummed with anticipation and nervous energy. For many students, this was their first haka, their first time feeling the ancient words move through their bodies, their first taste of something larger than themselves. Aroha had been to these assemblies before, always positioning herself near the back exit, ready to slip away if the attention became too much. She knew the words. Her father had taught them to her on quiet Sunday afternoons, his voice deep and sure as they practiced the movements together in their small lounge. But knowing and doing were different things entirely. The senior students began, their voices rising in unison, feet stamping against the wooden floor. The sound was primal, powerful, something that reached past thought into the bones and blood. Around her, Aroha felt bodies leaning forward, caught up in the rhythm and force of it. Even the teachers seemed transformed, their everyday selves falling away to reveal something older, more essential. As the voices rose, feet stomping, hands slapping thighs in rhythm, Aroha felt the sound echo in her bones. She remembered her father, strong and quiet, teaching her the words before he passed. Suddenly, almost without thinking, she stepped forward, just one pace. The others noticed. Her voice joined theirs, softer, but certain. The haka, that day, carried a different weight. When it finished, the hall was silent for a moment longer than usual. Then, applause. Her voice was rusty from disuse, cracking slightly on the higher notes, but it was hers. For the first time in months, she heard herself, not the whispered responses in class or the mumbled greetings at home, but her real voice, the one that carried stories and songs and all the words she'd kept locked away. The girl beside her, Sarah from her maths class, glanced over with something like surprise, then smiled. Not the cruel smile Aroha had grown used to, but something genuine, acknowledging. Around her, other faces turned, and for once the attention didn't feel threatening. It felt warm. When the last echoes faded and the applause began, Aroha felt tears on her cheeks. She hadn't realized she was crying. The principal's voice seemed to come from very far away as he thanked everyone for their participation, reminded them about the upcoming school fundraiser, dismissed them to their next classes. But Aroha remained standing, feeling the tremor in her legs, the rapid beating of her heart, the way the world looked different somehow, brighter, more possible. Word spread. The teachers asked Aroha to write about her experience, about her silence, about feeling alone, about the power she found in stepping forward. She wrote slowly, in the evenings, sitting by the window while the cold crept in, pausing often to listen to the lake's quiet breath. Mrs. Henderson approached her the next day, her expression gentle but determined. "I saw you yesterday," she said quietly, during the haka. There was something powerful about watching you find your voice." She paused, choosing her words carefully. "I'd like you to consider writing about that moment. Not for a grade, not for anyone else, just for you. Sometimes putting our experiences into words helps us understand them better." Aroha's first instinct was to decline, to retreat back into the safety of silence. But something in Mrs. Henderson's tone, the respect in it, the recognition, made her nod instead. "I don't know if I have much to say," she whispered, the first honest thing she'd said to a teacher in months. "I think you might surprise yourself," Mrs. Henderson replied. The writing came in fragments at first. A sentence here, a paragraph there, written at the kitchen table after Panya left for work, or curled up in her bedroom with the tea feather balanced on her windowsill. She wrote about the weight of silence, about the way it had become both protection and prison. She wrote about the note in her locker, about the small cruelties that had shaped her days, about the moment when ancient words had unlocked something inside her. But mostly, she wrote about her father. About Sunday afternoon haka lessons in their lounge, about the way he'd encouraged her to use her voice, about the carved bone pendant that still hung unworn in her jewelry box. "He taught me that speaking up doesn't always mean shouting," she wrote. "Sometimes it means choosing the right moment to let your silence break." Her essay was read at assembly. Some students turned away, embarrassed. Some listened with new respect. One teacher cried. Panya, sitting in the back row, squeezed the tea feather in her fist. Mrs. Henderson had asked permission first, of course. She'd read Aroha's essay, 3 pages of careful handwriting, and felt something shift in her understanding of the quiet girl she'd worried about for months. "This is powerful," she'd said, looking up from the pages. "Would you consider sharing it? Not the whole school necessarily, but perhaps at assembly? I think there might be other students who need to hear this." The suggestion terrified Aroha, but it also stirred something she hadn't felt in a long time: purpose. The night before the assembly, she'd barely slept, her stomach churning with anxiety and anticipation. She'd practiced reading it aloud to her reflection in the bathroom mirror, to the tea feather on her windowsill, to the photo of her father on her bedside table. Standing at the podium, looking out at hundreds of faces, Aroha felt her voice shake on the first few words. But as she continued reading, describing the isolation and pain but also the moment of breakthrough, her voice grew stronger. She saw recognition in some faces, other quiet kids, other outsiders, other students who'd learned to make themselves small to survive. When she finished, the silence was profound. Not the uncomfortable quiet that usually followed student presentations, but something deeper, more respectful. Then came the applause, not polite assembly clapping, but something warmer, more genuine. As she walked back to her seat, several students nodded at her, smiled, offered quiet words of encouragement. The story didn't end there. The local paper picked it up: Rotorua teen finds strength in silence. Letters arrived at school from other towns, kids who'd been bullied, parents who'd worried, teachers who'd never really understood. For the first time, Aroha felt seen, not for her pain, but for her quiet courage. The journalist was young, probably fresh out of university, with kind eyes and a gentle way of asking questions. She'd contacted the school after hearing about the assembly, asking if she could interview Aroha for a feature about youth mental health and bullying. The conversation took place in Mrs. Henderson's classroom after school, with Panya present for support. "What would you want other young people to know?" the journalist asked toward the end of their conversation. Aroha was quiet for a long moment, thinking about all the silent kids in all the small towns across New Zealand, all the students who'd learned to disappear to survive. That silence doesn't mean weakness, she said finally. Sometimes it means you're gathering strength. And when you're ready, when the moment feels right, your voice will be there waiting for you. The feature ran on a Sunday, with a photo of Aroha standing by Lake Rotorua, the morning mist rising behind her. Within days, letters began arriving at the school, pages and pages of them, from teenagers across the country sharing their own stories of isolation and survival, from parents thanking her for helping them understand their children better, from teachers recognizing the quiet students in their own classrooms. One letter came from a girl in Invercargill who'd been planning to leave school because of bullying. "Reading your story made me realize I'm not the only one," she wrote. "Maybe I can be brave like you." Another came from a boy in Napier whose stutter had made him a target for teasing. "You showed me that there are different ways to be strong," his letter said. The note that had once haunted her was gone. In its place, she hung the feather on her bedroom wall, no longer a secret, but a symbol. At graduation, the principal quoted her essay. Years later, new students would hear her story and understand that sometimes, speaking loudest isn't the only way to be strong. The cruel note had disappeared one day from her jersey pocket. She couldn't remember when exactly, only that one morning she'd reached for it and found nothing but lint and the smooth warmth of the tea feather. She'd searched her room, her school bag, the path to school, but it was gone as completely as if it had never existed. The feather, meanwhile, had found a permanent home on her bedroom wall, carefully mounted in a simple frame her mother had bought from the warehouse. It caught the morning light through her window, the colors shifting from black to green to blue depending on the angle of the sun. Visitors always noticed it, friends who came over to study, relatives visiting from out of town, the journalist who'd written her story. What's special about the feather? They'd ask, and Aroha would tell them about the day she'd found it, about carrying it through the hardest months of her life, about the way it had reminded her that beautiful things could fall from the sky when you least expected them. Aroha never became the most popular girl. She didn't need to. She walked with her head high, noticed the small things, the smell of wet earth after rain, the warmth of her mum's hand, the way the morning sun caught the mist on the lake. High school ended, and university began. Aroha chose to study social work at Massey University in Hamilton, not to run away this time, but to run towards something. She wanted to work with young people, to be the adult she'd needed during those dark months. Her lecturers were impressed by her insight, her ability to connect with vulnerable teenagers, her understanding of the complex ways that silence could be both shield and prison. During her practicum placement at a youth center in Hamilton, she met kids who reminded her of herself, quiet ones who'd learned to disappear, loud ones who'd learned to fight, clever ones who'd learned to manipulate their way through social hierarchies. She saw herself in all of them, recognized the strategies they'd developed to survive. The thing about silence, she'd tell them during group sessions, is that it's not always about being afraid to speak. Sometimes it's about choosing your moment. Sometimes it's about building up enough strength to say what really needs to be said. Even now, when asked about those years, she only smiles. Sometimes, silence is what makes you strong, she says. The pain never vanished. But it changed shape, into something that made her softer, wiser, and more open to the hidden battles of others. She kept in touch with Mrs. Henderson, sending updates about her studies, her work placements, her growing understanding of trauma and resilience. Her old teacher would share news about current students, kids who were struggling, kids who reminded her of Aroha, kids who might benefit from hearing about the quiet girl who'd found her voice through an ancient war dance. Sometimes Aroha would visit schools as a guest speaker, sharing her story with new audiences of teenagers who sat with familiar mixtures of boredom and curiosity and desperate hidden hope. She'd talk about the weight of silence, about the power of finding your voice, about the way that speaking up doesn't always mean shouting. Your voice matters, she'd tell them, looking out at faces that ranged from skeptical to desperately hopeful. Even if it's quiet. Even if it shakes. Even if you're the only one who hears it at first. It matters. Some afternoons, she visits the bushland behind her old school. She stands among the ponga trees, listening to the wind, the distant sounds of laughter, the calls of tea overhead. She thinks about the girl she was, and the nation that, slowly, quietly, learned to see her. The bush track is more overgrown now, barely visible through the native plantings that have been allowed to regenerate. The school has changed too, new buildings, new teachers, new students facing the same ancient challenges of belonging and identity and finding the courage to be themselves. But the tea still sing their liquid songs from the canopy, and sometimes Aroha finds their feathers along the path, not as perfect as the one she'd found all those years ago, but beautiful in their imperfection, their willingness to fall and be found by whoever might need them. She brings her own students here sometimes, teenagers from the youth center who are struggling with their own battles, who need to understand that healing doesn't always happen indoors, in offices, in formal therapeutic settings. Sometimes it happens in wild places, among ancient trees, in the company of birds who know instinctively when to sing and when to listen. No one ever spoke again of the cruel notes or the laughter in the corridors. Instead, in Rotorua, they remember the haka that stopped the room, and the quiet girl who, just once, dared to step forward. The bullying became something that was talked about now, acknowledged rather than ignored. Teachers received training about recognizing the signs of social isolation. Students learned about bystander intervention, about the responsibility that comes with witnessing someone else's pain. The school developed programs for kids who didn't fit the traditional molds, who needed different kinds of support to thrive. Aroha's essay was still read at assemblies, years later, her words carrying across time to reach new generations of students who needed to hear them. The haka remained an annual tradition, but it carried additional weight now, a reminder that finding your voice could happen in unexpected moments, that ancient traditions could unlock modern healing, that sometimes the quietest people had the most important things to say. She never brought it up again, but the feather still hangs on her wall. Have you ever chosen silence, and found strength in it? Thank you for walking this journey with me, Luca Mackin.